Hi, and welcome to this live reading from And the River Runs Deep, The Cold Case Murder Mystery of Leah Marcus by A.J. Ullman, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue. I never knew Leah Marcus. She was a girl on the verge of young womanhood, brutally murdered in her own bedroom in an upscale enclave of a mixed-race neighborhood in the city of Cincinnati. The same city that Mark Twain once opined that he hoped to be an inhabitant of when the world came to an end, because then, as now, as everyone knows, Cincinnati is 20 years behind the times. That aphorism, though, appears somewhat suspect given some of the racially charged atmospherics of Leah's case that played out all over the country just a few years later. Her life story has become my own work. It was improbable that we would have known each other at the time of her death. I was twice her age. We were not contemporaries, and the likelihood of our being colleagues or neighbors would have been slim. She was a rich girl from an affluent family who lived on the east side of Cincinnati, Ohio. I was a woman of Appalachian descent from the west side of town, a gulf wider than the seemingly boundless chasm of the Mill Creek Valley spanned by the Western Hills Viaduct that crossed over the visible barrier, Interstate 75, that split the city in two. But our lives were bound together, hers at least by virtue of her murder, mine by being the then crime reporter for the Cincinnati Tribune, one of the daily newspapers of the city at a time when daily newspapers were cherished institutions, and being the crime reporter for the paper of a mid-sized city was a big deal. The world of journalism now looks nothing like the bright future I predicted. Then, I was a recent graduate of Ohio University, where I, the first hillbilly ever from my family among generations of such children ever to have gone to college, majored in the journalistic arts. My professional education did not begin right out of high school. I had several detours along the way, waitressing at different restaurants, working at a bookstore downtown, and giving birth at age 20 to a wonderful daughter. I soon realized that her father and I would never be compatible, and severing that relationship, knowing that I had full responsibility for the care of this child, decided to go to college, a single mom. College, despite being at a school renowned for its party habits, was not a drunken splurge of sorority parties. I had a mission, a scholarship, an apartment in town, daycare for my girl, and a regimen of study that earned me a 4.0 GPA and a slot on the student newspaper, The Post. I graduated with a degree in journalism, summa cum laude, and with membership in Phi Beta Kappa. After graduation, I scored a job as a cub reporter for the Cincinnati Tribune, and over a few short years, worked my way up to crime reporter. My job was to follow criminal cases that were newsworthy, typically murders from the time of death of the victim to the arrest of a suspect, through the court proceedings and trial to, if necessary, the scene of the death chamber at Lucasville State Prison. Never as a journalist did I dream that I would write true crime, that tried and true genre that captivates the public and has spilled over onto television. There is a certain Schadenfreude effect at reading about or watching other people's miseries with a breathy comment along the lines of, "There but the grace of God." Real murders are solved, if they are ever solved, within the first 48 hours after commission of the crime. This well-worn crime statistic is part of the Bible of criminal investigators because, as the trail goes cold, the chance of catching the perpetrator diminishes. Few people confess to murder 40 years later as they breathe their last. Those deeds they take straight to Hades, veiled in mystery as their own stone-cold corpse lays under a diaphanous shroud on a deathbed. Most murders are committed by people who knew the victim. The police are well aware of this statistic too. Most murders are not perpetrated by sophisticated, handsome serial killers like Ted Bundy. The typical killer is male, not particularly bright, and slips up when talking to the detectives, and before the lawyer arrives, as part and parcel of cutting a deal to avoid lethal injection. Few crimes are actually solved by journalists years after the fact. Despite the odds of such an outcome, I consider it my sacred duty to find the truth of Leah's murder. Leah Marcus's death held the city spellbound during the spring and summer of 2001. Her murder, the alleged murder of the beautiful young white woman at the hands of a black man, gripped the city like so many crimes involving sex, race, and class. This was a time forever etched in my mind, wrongly as it turned out, as one of national innocence. Before the horrors of 9/11 made it clear to the whole world, and most noticeably to us as privileged citizens of the USA, that the American century was fully and finally over. In those months prior to the national tragedy, a smaller Greek or perhaps Shakespearean tragedy was playing out on an unlikely stage, the Midwestern city of Cincinnati. Our country and my former city have a mixed record on race relations. This is the result of the by no means unique American institution of slavery, which to this day colors matters of civic discourse between members of ostensibly one cohesive society, but in reality a fractured set of cultures and subcultures. Cincinnati police officers had on numerous occasions shot and killed unarmed black men, and the city was by the spring seething with a lid covering the cauldron. But the steam leaked out. It would all come to a cataclysmic head in early April when the cover finally blew off. Amidst that explosion, one particularly nasty crime, unrelated to the riots but perhaps not, would captivate the city for months. Numerous innocent white victims were assaulted by the mob in Cincinnati. Leah Marcus wasn't directly one of those victims, but indirectly she was as surely a casualty as if she had been standing at ground zero when the towers came tumbling down a few months later. Chapter 1. North Avondale. Her mother found the body on the floor of her daughter's bedroom, naked, hands tied behind her back, lying on her left side with a cord wrapped around her neck. Leah Marcus died at the age of 17 years and 11 months, the victim of a murder and possibly a sexual assault. She was, by all accounts, a fine young woman. "Someone who was going places," said Vernon Banks, the creepy neighbor who lived 3 doors down the street and who was the first person other than Leah's mother and the police to hear the news, courtesy of the police scanner he often listened to. Mr. Banks himself, briefly, would be considered a suspect. She was a National Merit Scholarship winner as well as an accomplished musician, and heading off to Harvard University, her father's alma mater, in the fall, after she was to have graduated from Walnut Hills High School, a top 50 public high school in all of the country. In that year, 2001, Leah Marcus was one of 15,980 murder victims in the United States. The city of Cincinnati, Ohio, where the murder occurred, experienced 55 murders. Cincinnati also had its share of forcible rapes that year, 358 reported. Leah's death might otherwise have been a mere footnote to a list of senseless tragedies that the nation and its families experienced, but for the fact that it occurred at an explosive time in the city's sometimes explosively violent history, that of the riots of April 2001. Leah was killed on Thursday, April 12th, 2 months before her high school graduation, during the 4th day of those infamous race riots that racked Cincinnati that year. The riots made national, even international news, and were the largest civic disturbance in the U.S. since the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles in 1992. The riots blew open after years of simmering race relations in the city came to a head when a Cincinnati police officer, Stephen Roach, shot and killed an unarmed 19-year-old African-American male, Timothy Thomas, in the predominantly African-American community of Over the Rhine, just north of the city's central business district. A long history of police brutality against blacks and racial profiling boiled over with the death of Mr. Thomas. From April 9th through 13th, the riots paralyzed the city and yielded opportunities for crimes ranging from beatings, lootings, robberies, and, with Leah's death, perhaps even murder. Leah Marcus's boyfriend, Damon Albright, was an 18-year-old classmate of Leah's, the son of a preacher, gifted singer, and star point guard for the Walnut Hills Eagles basketball team. He is also African American. Ultimately, and soon after the murder, he would become the police's prime suspect in Leah's death. So, it was against the background of the race riots, themselves to be overshadowed soon by the even more incendiary events of the summer of 2001, 9/11, that Leah's death and the investigation of her murder played out. For a period of time that spring and summer, other than the riots themselves, the Marcus death, its own microcosm of sex, murder, race, religion, and class, gripped the city of Cincinnati like no other story. Leah was the younger of two children of Ben and Sarah Marcus. She had an older brother, David, who was a sophomore at the University of Chicago. Both Sarah and Ben Marcus were highly educated, successful, and rich individuals, themselves the products of successful Cincinnati families. Sarah is the CEO of Greater Cincinnati Wellsprings, a nonprofit agency that assists mentally ill individuals, the daughter of the rabbi of Cincinnati's largest Jewish Reformed congregation. Ben Marcus is a world-famous trial lawyer, the self-professed master of disaster, or sometimes the prince of torts, who headed a firm that handled class action lawsuits that yielded millions in fees. He was, next to Carl Lindler, who was the only person from Cincinnati ever to join the Billionaire Club, one of the richest men in the area with a net worth in excess of $500 million. Damon Albright was one of 6 children of the Reverend Othello Albright, pastor of the Mount Carmel Baptist Church, and his wife Dolores, herself a preacher's daughter. The fact that the mothers of the victim and the prime suspect were themselves children of clergymen was one of the interesting minor facts of the case and the source of much gossip. Mount Carmel was not the largest congregation in Cincinnati, but one of the most influential, its leaders having been in the forefront of the civil rights era and the unofficial bully pulpit for the African American community's stance on the city's race relations. The Albrights, like the Marcuses, lived in a leafy community of the city called North Avondale, only a few miles from downtown, home to Xavier University. Cincinnati has 52 neighborhoods, and North Avondale is one of them, centrally located between downtown and the northern edge of the city. North Avondale, according to its neighborhood association, encompasses an area of approximately 1.3 square miles. 3/4 of the population is black, the rest mostly white. Bounded on the east by Victory Parkway near Xavier University, on the south by Glenwood, on the west by Vine Street, and on the north by East Mitchell, almost 6,000 people call North Avondale home. The median income is $30,000, just a few dollars more than the average household income throughout the city. Nonetheless, some very rich people live in some beautiful, expensive, and architecturally significant homes, including those of the Queen Anne, Victorian, Italian Renaissance, English medieval, and Greek revival styles, but many built in the period between 1890 and 1930. The USA is a nation bored of violence and war, and whose midwife was the indiscriminate shedder of blood. Cincinnati is no stranger to that legacy. The city is first and foremost a river city. Originally settled by white people around the protection of Fort Washington, the namesake fort still bears the name of a major traffic artery in town. The fort was erected across the Ohio River from the spot where the Licking River, which separates the cities of Newport and Covington, Kentucky, empties into the Ohio. The original founders named the fledgling city after the Roman citizen soldier hero Cincinnatus. But before it acquired that name, the settlement was known as Losaniville, a hodgepodge name derived from Latin meaning the city at the mouth of the river, meaning the mouth of the Licking River. In the 1700s, the American waterways were the equivalent of today's interstate highways, moving people and commerce around the country. A not uncommon unsettling sight for some of those first settlers was the scalped bodies of their fellow colonists and water-tinged red from the blood of those white people murdered by the Native Americans as revenge for the theft of their land. The history of European settlement of this continent is replete with violence, death, and destruction. Cincinnati itself sits in the basin of a large river valley, hemmed in by, again, borrowing from Roman legend, 7 hills. At first, those hills proved a formidable barrier to the expansion of the city. But industrial might and inclined streetcars helped pave the expansion up and over that first tier of hills surrounding the valley. As the population of the city swelled in the early 1800s, people migrated out of the river basin and up the hills into what were then the suburbs, and the village of Avondale sprang into existence. Avon is the Celtic word for river, and dale refers to a valley. Oddly, there is neither a river in North Avondale nor a valley. In fact, the neighborhood rests at one of the higher elevations of the entire city. Later, it would be annexed into the city of Cincinnati and eventually renamed North Avondale in deference to a community slightly to its south, just plain Avondale. When originally settled and subdivided, large tracts of land were developed for people of wealth to build stately homes. Some of these famous people included Barney Kroger, founder of still the country's largest grocery store chain, Kroger; Andrew Erkenbrecher, founder of the Cincinnati Zoo, which is bounded on one side of the eponymously named street; Frank Hershey of the Hershey Clock Company; Samuel Pogue of Pogue's Department Store; and Robert Mitchell, furniture magnate. The architect Samuel Hannaford designed the Mitchell House in 1893. Mitchell actually built the home for his son, Richard. Hannaford is best remembered for some jewels of Cincinnati architecture, such as City Hall and Music Hall. City Hall was built over 5 years and completed the same year the Mitchell House was built. In 1893, Cincinnati's denizens paid $1,860,000 for their new municipal governing building. In today's dollars, that would be almost $50 million. Although that figure doesn't do justice to the intricacies of the building, dating from a time when labor costs were much cheaper than would be available today. Robert Mitchell immigrated to the United States from Ireland in 1829, apprenticed as a cabinet maker, and eventually struck out on his own, establishing a partnership with Frederick Ramelsburg, one of thousands of Germans who migrated to Cincinnati. Many of these families lived in a neighborhood just north of the Miami and Erie Canal in the city center, which has since been filled in and paved and is now known as Central Parkway. That area is still known today as Over the Rhine. Mitchell and Ramelsburg furniture, known for rosewood, mahogany, and walnut wood with elaborate carvings, often of animals, is still widely collected today. Their partnership lasted until the end of the 1800s.